Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another Unreal Let's Play. Today I'm going to be playing my Unreal Museum, now in its entirety. So if we hit play here. So, I'm just going to hop around. This is my observation viewpoint. You can see all my little exhibits out there. We're going to be visiting each and every one of them today. So if we hop into our fancy schmancy teleport booth, let's hit A to go to the Women's History exhibit. So here's my helpful sign telling you where you are. Let's go over here. We have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Credit Mott, who organized the Seneca Falls Convention. More about that in here. I already talked about all this in my first video. I'm just going to do a quick recap for you. So we have Susan B. Anthony, who was put on trial for trying to vote, and the Flappers, and some World War II and 1950s ads and pictures showing where women were perceived to be and where their place was, which was bad, because this is obviously a very sexist ad, and this luckily has gotten better, but it still has quite a ways to go. So I got my video to work, which is pretty cool. Way up in here, this is just a quick little video. Well, not a quick little video, it's just a video showing how women are still perceived in society today by this woman walking around in New York. And then we go over here, we got a graph, we got my women's history essay. Now luckily I didn't have to do an essay for my other exhibits. That saved me a lot of time while I was making this. Alright, so now we hop back into here, and let's see progressive era, that is B. Alright, so now we're here. So we got movie posters. Now playing A New Hope, Industrialism and Progressivism Episode 2, Price, Surgeon Sour Dooley, Theater 2. This is my another helpful handy dandy sign. So let's go over to industrialism first. We got a picture of some child workers showing the injuries and poor conditions. A political cartoon showing the captains of industry who were oppressing all of the workers and common people. Here we have workers going on strike. This is the Pullman strike, I believe, and they did this to hoping that conditions would get better. So now let's go watch my movie. So I have it hop into first person here. It makes it easier to see. Imagine the Star Wars music here. Yeah, that's the opening scene of my first movie. So now if we go over to progressivism, we have just a couple quick things. This is Theodore Roosevelt, who broke up monopolies and big businesses. This is pretty much fixing all of the bad stuff that happened in the industrialist era. Then there's The Jungle, which is by Upton Sinclair, who was a muckraker, which means he exposed the big businesses and the horrible practices that they had. And here's my second movie, hopping back into first person again. It's a similar opening, but it has Episode 2, A New Hope. And then there's me. I was the starring actor in this film. That's just the opening scene. If I hop back out of here, it goes back into third person. You can see that our movie paused in there. So we'll go over back into our handy dandy teleport booth. Let's go to the African American exhibit, which is C. Alright, so now we're here. Still got another handy dandy sign. So we have, starting off back here, after the Civil War, a period called Reconstruction, where the government tried to fix all of the problems that led to the Civil War to begin with, namely like slavery and racism. But as you can see in that picture, it didn't really work out that well, because after the failure of Reconstruction, we have segregated drinking fountains and just bad stuff like that. Like they had the races separated, and they held a doctrine called separate but equal. That obviously wasn't the case, as in this picture. And there was Ida B. Wells, who was an author, who told people to flee the injustices of the South and go to the North, where conditions were at least a little bit better. And people listened. This is the Great Migration, a picture of a family, like one family out of thousands, hundreds of thousands, who went north during an era during segregation, discrimination, and racism. This is Paul Laurence Dunbar, who is a famous Daytonian. He was the first black poet to gain national recognition. So this is black people were sort of bringing themselves up in society and making them seem better to the white people who controlled everything pretty much. And this is African Americans. They went to Chicago during the Great Migration. It was a hub for people moving there because of jobs and economic opportunities. And better treatment too. But in the South, still, we had segregated buses, and this was true for a lot of the nation. There's segregated buses of blacks that sit in the back. It's kind of hard to see there, but those separators there say colored seating only. And then Rosa Parks, really famous person, she gave up her seat. She didn't give up her seat on the bus, and she stayed in her seat, and that started a boycott that pretty much launched the civil rights movement. And back in Chicago, race tensions built when a black swimmer accidentally went to a white area, and started riots all across the city. This led to a lot of destruction and killing of black people. And now it's time for World War II. African Americans are fighting in World War II. They signed up and are wanting to serve in the military, but the military is discriminating and not letting them serve, or is paying them much less than other soldiers. And so, in spite of this, they started the Double V campaign, which is for a double victory against the fascists in Germany and Europe, and against the racists at home in the U.S. And then, in the 30s and 40s, there was the Harlem Renaissance, which was the resurgence of African American culture and identity. It was a lot similar to the Renaissance in Italy, which was people rediscovering the Roman and the Greeks and the classics. It is similar to this, but with African Americans and their African roots. We have jazz musicians and the Cotton Club, which is really famous for all of its music and culture. There was a big hub in Harlem, New York, which is where the Renaissance gets its name after. Then here's arguably the most famous person in the history of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. And he fought peacefully for civil rights, which seems like it's an oxymoron, but really, he protested peacefully. He was a big advocate of that, and he was a preacher. And then here was Malcolm X, which is another advocate for civil rights, but he had a more radical approach, which is more aggressive and more militarian. Then over here we have the symbol for Black Power, which Malcolm X spread. It was the idea that blacks should overthrow and become the ruling people instead of white people. And then this was the March for Freedom, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and a huge gathering of African Americans for civil rights. And this is Martin Luther King giving his famous I Have a Dream speech. And I tried to have the actual speech play when you entered here, but very sadly it didn't work, and I couldn't figure it out in time before the due date arrived. So, supposed to have the speech playing there, really famous speech. And it's his dream of what America should look like. Alright, and then we hop back into the booth here, and hop back into the booth here. Let's go to D. We're back at our scenic viewing platform. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this Unreal Let's Play. I'd like to see you next time. Be sure to like that smash subscribe button, and yeah, see you next time.
Hi, my name is Cameron Vaught, and welcome to this video featuring my American History Museum. So let's get right into it. Here I have 3 exhibits featured, which is the Women's History Museum, the Industrialization and Progressivism Era exhibit, and the African American exhibit. We're going to get right into it with the woman's history. So here I just designed it with some quotes on the walls that I feel mean a lot to what women's history was and is, by Shirley Chisholm and Alice Paul, 2 very influential people of the time with women's right and suffrage. And we'll start with the Cult of True Womanhood. You walk in, you can just press E and learn a little bit about the Cult of True Womanhood. They had qualities in the 1800s of submissiveness, purity, piety, and domesticity. They were basically required for a woman. She'd have to be happy to stay at home and cook and clean, and she didn't really, do that much outside of the home. She stayed in the private sphere, but eventually women became kind of sick of this, and they wanted a little bit more. So we'll go into the next exhibit. Here again, you can just see a picture of Alice Paul. And eventually, women started to get together because they were only really allowed to spend time with other women. And they decided they had enough. So one night, they talked to their husbands, and they said, we want to be able to vote and have a place outside of the private sphere. So again, you can pause the video and take a look at what I wrote. But people like Alice Paul and Susan B. Anthony stood up for women's suffrage. The next exhibit, talking about wartime. Women's suffrage was gained in 1921, and soon afterwards, movements like flappers came in, but wartime struck with World War II, and women had a huge role in that. So Rosie the Riveter is up on the wall, a huge icon for the war, to show that women can come and work in the factories while the men were off fighting. They came in, took their jobs, and helped with the big war effort. But after that didn't mean women had it easy. They kind of came back to where the cult of true womanhood were. They cleaned and they took care of their kids. So having the nuclear family of 4 was the big deal back then. You take care of your kids, stay home, cook and clean. They gave up their jobs once more and to stay home. But eventually they wanted to take jobs and go out into the public sphere, and that was 1950s, so we're still a little bit, we're coming out of it, but women are more equal today. So now we are going to head into our industrialization and progressivism era exhibit and movie room. So here we're going to press E, and again, at any time that I press E, feel free to pause and try to read what I wrote, but it basically talks about industrialization and progressivism era. I'm going to play it again. It ranged from the 1800s to the early 1900s, before the Great Depression. It was a time of poverty and corruption through big businesses. As you can see, there's some cartoon work here where the big businessmen are getting their success and riches off of the common people. A lot of poverty around this time, a lot of corruption. And if you wanted to, right here, you could go to the African American exhibit. But we're going to keep walking. Here were some of the titans of industry, such as Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan are all highlighted here. They're the 4 we really learned about and dove into. You can walk up and learn about each one. I'm just going to give you a brief history. So Cornelius Vanderbilt was the railroad tycoon. He bought a ton of railroads, had a ton of them made, and he was big on transportation and became super rich. He was the oldest out of all of them. John D. Rockefeller was the oil industry tycoon. He saw the value in the oil industry and decided to take advantage of that and quickly gained a monopoly of the oil industry for, and Andrew Carnegie, steel industry. He as well saw value in steel. He's actually an Irish immigrant, so an immigrant and soon to be known as one of the richest men in the whole world. And J.P. Morgan was the economics and banker. He was born to a wealthy family and eventually opened up his own bank. And one thing about all these people, at one point or another, they were labeled as robber barons or people who would treat their workers badly and not fair and not pay them enough, but at the same time take the money for themselves. And eventually almost all of them became philanthropists, but donated money to different places. Here we have our silent film. If you would like to know what it is about a little bit more, I'll try to get you a good view. You could pause and read that little, hold on, the sign behind me tells you a little bit about it. But sadly, I've had some, oh wait, no, here it is, never mind. It's right here, and if you would like to pause it, you can jump up or exit the room. But yeah, that's me right there, putting on the jacket because it's so cold, but it talks about sewing factories and the conditions that workers faced. And eventually, towards the end of the movie, you'll see it gets better because we talk to Theodore Roosevelt, which is actually the next portion of this, our progressivism place. So you can press E here, and it's a lot, so feel free to pause and read. But it basically talks about how Theodore Roosevelt came in and busted all the people who were taking advantage of people. People would protest and try to stick up for themselves. The 8 hours for work, for rest, and for what we will was a big thing. And now we're going to head back down to the African American exhibit. But yeah. So, as we head into here, take a look. You can pause and read. But basically, this just talks about how there was de facto segregation a lot, which was basically after the Civil War. You would think African Americans had it easier and they were good to go, but sadly that was not the case. De facto segregation ruled, and as segregation wasn't legal, it wasn't illegal either, so it was more of a custom for everyone, mainly in the South, to have segregated areas, and sometimes even up north the beaches were segregated, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But here we can learn about Jim Crow, which was a character that quickly gained momentum and became known as the standard for living for people. Like back in the day, it was the standard that people were segregated, and they called them Jim Crow laws. African Americans were treated as second-class citizens. Soon, they got enough of that after, up in the north on a beach, a boy swam into a whites-only zone, and some white kids saw this, started throwing rocks at him, and he drowned. So that is thought to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and that's kind of what caused the civil rights movement, some people think. The civil rights movement was a huge, huge thing. It was a movement that took many forms. Rosa Parks' arrest was a big, it's a big factor into leading into it. Yes, but we're running out of time on this video, so I'm just going to have to go a little bit quicker. But yeah, there were sit-ins and everything. If you want to read, go ahead, you'll learn a little bit more. Harlem Renaissance is the last part of this exhibit. In the 1920s, African Americans started to move up north to get more jobs, and I'm just going to start walking out. But as they started to get more jobs, this is the fast track to the gift shop. They wanted to just be able to express themselves up north. So as they started to do that, places like the Cotton Club opened, and they were able to show what they are, and that caused a lot of pride for them. But yeah, that's pretty much my video. If you want to go back and read some of the things, it was kind of rushed, but yeah, thank you for watching my video, and I might see you in another one. Alright, bye!
Hello, my name is Garrett Quinn, and this is my recording for my 3 exhibits of my virtual history museum. The first exhibit I'll be going into is the women's exhibit, and the first thing I'll be going over is the public and private sphere. The public and private sphere were basically designated areas for men and women that defined what they were able to do during the 1800s. The public sphere defined men as being able to participate in politics, work and do things of that sort, whereas the private sphere dictated that women would work in the home and be caretakers for children and whatnot. The next exhibit I'll be going into is the World War II exhibit. I guess I should have mentioned the press of R here. Here's this chunk of information. Feel free to read it. Now onto the women in World War II. Again at the press of E. During World War II, many of the jobs that were done by men were unable to be done by men now, since men were the ones going off to war. And this motivated women to work and become patriotic for their country. And once men did come back, and they ended up inevitably taking those jobs back, it only inspired women to do work more because they got a taste of what work was like and they really wanted to do it. Next, what I will be talking about is women's suffrage. Now at the press of T, women's suffrage was powerhoused arguably by 2 people, these 2 people being Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretta Mott, who had led the Seneca Falls Convention and proposed the Declaration of Sentiments, which was written in a similar way to the Declaration of Independence. And this did it resonated with a lot of people because of this. And it really inspired people to want women to have the right to vote. And ultimately in the 1920s, or 1920, I mean, the right to vote was given to women. And here's my essay for this. Once again, feel free to read any of the pages if you so choose. My next exhibit will be the Industrialization and Progressive Era. Museum, excuse me. And one thing I will mention is the large design change that did take place. Rather than having large chunks of information here, I rather would put the thing that I will be going over. So, as the title had shown, this will be going over industrialization. So after the Civil War, the North's industrialization had entered the Industrial Revolution. And this had led to them being able to create things at a much faster rate. And it really was important to them. Especially, it founded their economy. To the South, where their economy was dependent on the plantation, the North's economy had become dependent on the industry. But with this did come problems. One of them being that industries were very powerful and to an extent very unsafe. Working conditions in a job were very often not the safest whatsoever. You would likely already be working 10-hour days, but the problem would also be that it wasn't safe. Books such as The Jungle by Upton Sinclair were able to expose things like this, such as meat factories that would make hamburgers would sometimes have human left in them because people would fall into the grinders. And people would be waiting out in the freezing cold for a job because everybody needed a job. Workers were expendable at this time. And workers themselves weren't able to face the industries. And this was eventually what led into the creation of worker unions, which gets into the Progressive Era. So, in the Progressive Era, unions and people such as Henry Ford and Theodore Roosevelt were able to advocate for the workers' rights and eventually get them the more fair work, 8-hour workdays, safe working conditions, etc. Eventually, though, World War I did end the Progressive Era, but working conditions and whatnot have most definitely improved. And for this, we did create 2 movies. And finally, onto my last exhibit is the African American history. So once again, after the Civil War, the South was supposed to give the right to vote to African Americans, and this was obviously enforced by the Emancipation Proclamation and other things. But the South was very hesitant, putting in Jim Crow and de facto laws, forcing people to take a literacy test or poll tax and other things of the such, which were created to make it so that African Americans could not vote. And obviously this being focused on Jim Crow, other laws were put in place, and lynchings and other things of the sort took place, and obviously segregation. And this being a factor of it, and many other reasons, many did move to the North in what was known as the Great Migration. And they moved to big cities, such as Harlem, and other cities of the sort, and able to look for jobs, better conditions politically, and that's not to say the North was perfect, it wasn't, but it was most definitely better than the South, and other things, and this really did enable them to flourish a little bit better, and it eventually did lead to them creating their own culture, and one such thing known as the Harlem Renaissance, which allowed them to share their culture with many people, and that did really help also to lessen the racial divide that was between the whites and the African Americans. And finally, I will be going into the civil rights movement of predominantly the 1960s. So at the price of tea here, I have two figures. On the left is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and on the right is Malcolm X. And both had very, very, very different views on how to approach the way of getting civil rights. King's way was very peaceful and almost to make themselves into the victim, to make people care for somebody they may not have once cared for. For example, they would go into restaurants, sit down, and even if they were getting attacked by many, many, many white customers, they would sit there and they would take it, and they treated going to prison as a badge of honor. Which I may add is incredibly brave. Whereas Malcolm X wanted change immediately, and one way he did see that was with armed forces. And that's not to say that he would go out of his way to attack, but he made it very clear that if he was attacked, he would attack back. And neither were necessarily at each other's throat, but they didn't necessarily get along, although they did get together sometimes to help for the same movement. And they were both working for the same cause, which was racial equality. And eventually, things did get better. Not perfect, but better. And that is where I would say that it is going to this day. And I think that is where I'm going to wrap up my video. Once again, these were my 3 museums. And thank you once again for watching.
Hello, I'm Ivy Daniel, and welcome to my virtual history museum. This museum mainly focuses on growth and reformation and the progressiveness in rights and how America has grown throughout history. Starting off is my Women's History Museum. I will be showing you how women's rights have progressed between the 1800s, 1900s, and 2000s, current time. The call of domesticity was one of the main things that ruled the country in how they viewed the two sexes or different sexes in the United States. Mainly on how women acted and how they should act. These were the 4 qualities that ruled how a true woman was: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. This is a further explanation on what the cult of domesticity is. And one of the main things was if a woman did not act the way that society thought she should, she was basically shunned and not thought of as a true woman. Finally, women had enough of this, and both movements of women and both men got together in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and they wrote, "This is where the Declaration of Sentiments came into place." If this sounds familiar to you, then congratulations, you know one of the most important documents in history, which is the Declaration of Independence. This was done on purpose to purposely mimic it so people would take it more seriously. These are some of the very important leaders in the 1820s. 2 of them, which is Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, actually organized the Seneca Falls Convention. These other 2 women, Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth, they were also very important in feminists. I'm pretty sure feminism actually, it wasn't the proper term, but actually started during this time, mostly in the 1900s. The 1900s were a very important time, and it was the burst of women's rights, starting with the 19th Amendment. Before then, some of the rights that they didn't have one of them was the right to vote, which was most important to them in this time, and this was finally given to them in 1920. 1920s was also the flapper era, which a whole bunch of women who finally got the right to vote, they wanted more rights. They realized they became more educated and realized that the way they were being treated was not fair at all. And the flapper became a huge thing in young women. The qualities that described them were energetic, bold, fun-loving, and rebellious, which was the complete opposite to the cult of domesticity qualities. I can just say that a lot of people did not like this because it was a huge change, and they still thought, of many of the older generation thought that, still believe some of the old ways of thinking, which applied to the cult of domesticity. This was also a time when women were able to work and get jobs. It was still very hard, but in over 300,000 women served in the military during World War I, and this was a huge step in progressing and getting more and more rights. Another burst of rights is actually in the 2000s to current time. One of the big things, the giant things, was that in 2016 there was actually a presidential candidate who was female, Hillary Clinton. Even though she didn't win the election, it was still a huge step in women's history, because in the 1800s this wouldn't even be a thought, that it wouldn't even be possible for this to happen. Even though she didn't win, now, I'm not sure how, in the last few years there have been 104 female House members and 21 female senators. This is a world record, and actually it is a world record in how many women are in Congress, and it's incredible. There has also been one of the largest marches in history, the Women's Rights March in 2018. It advocated for all women's rights as well as Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ rights. The thought of even standing up and speaking in the street would have been impossible in the 1820s, because one of the things, actually a fun fact, is that if a woman even thought of divorcing her husband or outright said it, she would be put in a mental asylum. Moving on to growth. There was actually growth in the Industrialization unit, which deals with the Industrialization era. Surprise. The biggest thing in here is that big businesses and monopolies ruled the United States, and it was very hard for people to get fair jobs and fair wages because the working conditions were very harsh, and the people in charge would treat their workers unfairly and work them to death, literally. Some of the big businessmen who ran monopolies were John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie. To quickly sum up what a monopoly is monopolies came to the United States with colonial administration. Stronger companies competed with weaker companies when the demand for a product was high. The companies would lower the prices, so other companies would also lower their prices, causing the weaker companies to go out of business. Then the stronger companies would take this opportunity to raise their price to as high as they wanted, because there wasn't any competition anymore. But this was not good for workers, because not only were they working for minimum wage, but since the businesses would raise their prices even more, they couldn't afford it. This would happen until the Reformation, which Henry Ford and Theodore Roosevelt came into place. When the current president of the time died, Theodore Roosevelt, who was vice president, became president. He was more progressive than he let on, and he wanted big businesses. He didn't like how big businesses treated their workers and how they ran. So he made many changes and acts, and one of them was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which ended big business monopolies. So one person couldn't run a whole industry. Henry Ford was also a big change. He began an automobile business, and it was one of the most modernized automobiles. And not only did he do this, he was the first person to pay his workers $5 a day, which is much more than they used to. Workers used to get like 1 cent for, I'm pretty sure it was less than 5 cents for each piece that they made. And they would also have to work 14 hours a day, which was much different, and Henry Ford shortened his workers to 8 hours. He also marked his
marked as cars at an affordable price, because not only would they be paid little from other industries, but their cars would be way too expensive. Along with reformation and growth of rights, this brings us to the African American History Unit. In this time, African Americans were treated terribly. This began when slavery started and didn't end until like the late 1900s, and there's still racism going on today. But during the Civil Rights Movement, there was huge change and progressive rights. Four of the main leaders who were in and ran different movements were Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. Rosa Parks, everyone's heard of her. She was the woman who stood up for herself on the Montgomery bus and refused to give her seat up to a white man. But not only did she do that, her arrest wasn't a coincidence. She was actually part of NAACP's program. She was an active member, and she served as a secretary and later youth leader of the local branch. At the time of her arrest, she was preparing for a major youth conference, and her also doing this sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, and it was a chain reaction which made a whole bunch of other civil rights movements. Ella Baker was part of and also was a big member and organizing SNCC, pronounced SNCC, and the big thing that separates her from the rest is that she wanted to change now, immediate change, and she also wanted this to be applied to younger members of African American community, because she felt that other groups didn't include them, and because young African Americans and during this time were the new generation, and this was for their life. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were two of the biggest leaders, but they had very polar opposites way of doing things. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his main beliefs were that he wanted to make change through peaceful protest and progressive change, and a huge amount of people supported this. But Malcolm X, he wanted immediate change, and he wasn't afraid to use violence because he felt it was unfair that people were telling African Americans to be peaceful, but they would not tell white people who were attacking and making this violence on African Americans to be peaceful. These are also four of the main amendments that were most important in assuring African American rights, because there would be laws put in place and rules, but no one would reinforce them, so nothing would happen. There would be no person ensuring their rights would stay, but once these amendments were put into place, it would assure it. These are also three civil rights organizations that were the biggest. It was the Black Panther Party, NAACP, and SNCC. All three of them chose different methods of assuring their rights, but all three of them had the same goal in mind. NAACP is actually still going on today and is current. Another one of the more recent civil rights movements is Black Lives Matter, which was made in 2012. Thank you so much for coming to my virtual history museum and taking time out of your day to listen. Before I go, I want to show you, this is all of the websites I went to get the information along with in class. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.
Hello, this is Danielle Bull, and I am going to be playing my history museum that is complete. So, yeah. So, basically, it says, "Welcome to my World History Museum." Over here we still have the Rosie the Riveter, and as you can see up in the corner it says Pressy. If it's capturing it. Okay, I don't know. Over here, the letters I have my women's history essay and just a glass ceiling metaphor thing for the glass ceiling. Don't mind the extra wording in the corner. I accidentally was in the wrong trigger box. Anyway, so over here I have this poster that describes kind of the food rationing. And here I still have my women's history timeline. If you watched the other video, you know I went more into detail on that. Okay, so coming over here to the industrial and progressive era, you go down into this factory, and I have explanations about each different thing. So I have like Rockefeller's, this one over here describes the different trusts and immigration and what caused this time period. Over here I have labor strikes, and it explains labor strikes. I made the wording like 30 seconds long, so it takes a while to go away. My bad. And then over here I have a poster about, and it press E and you can read about Theodore Roosevelt. Oh, actually this one's press F. My bad. Sorry, I'm doing really bad at this. So this I have another reading, which is about the jungle, and that's just a short description of it. And then if you come into here, you will see my the silent films that me and my group did. They start playing, and I have it so that all of them are combined into one video. So it's kind of like just a giant movie theater. And I really like how this part turned out. So going back up, now you may see in the corner that says this museum may have some sections that are sensitive. Please be respectful. I also have it down here because up here I have my African American History Museum, as you can see up there. So here we go. So basically I have a description about Jim Crow and the segregation. Over here, if you press F, you can learn about the Great Migrations and lynching. I have a little paper right there. You can't pick it up, but you can sort of read it. Coming over here, I have, you press E, you can read about the Harlem Renaissance, which is pretty long. So I have that as 35 seconds, I believe. Over here, I have a description, if you press F, about the civil rights movements. And then over here in this little foldable sort of thing, I have describing World War II. And it just says, when World War II had begun, many African Americans didn't know what to do. And it just continues. I'm not going to read all that. So I have pictures of the Tuskegee Airmen, some World War II images, and then I also have the double victory, and it explains that in the description. Over here, if you press F to read about civil rights activists, it explains SNCC and CORE. Sorry that it's like partially cut off again. And over here, you can read about Martin Luther King Jr. So that is my African American History Museum part. And yeah, so if you come down here, I have working lights, and I still have the zesty lemony cube. It doesn't go upstairs, and I don't know, like, I think it could go upstairs if you actually tried, but, like, yeah, it's difficult. So I didn't want those to be brought up to those stairs because it's a sensitive topic sort of thing. Anyway, so over here I still have my bolt shrubbery. A little bit difficult to see now, and you'll understand why in just a moment. If I can walk. Thank you. So over here, you can jump onto that. There's a smokestacks. And then you jump again, you land on this flat spot. Oh man, what's this? You may be wondering. Well, you jump down, and it's a waterfall. Woo! Because I'm extra. And then down in the pool, we got some little play toys. And yeah, we got a ball and a swimming tube that neither of them have any point to them whatsoever. So, yeah, if I get out of play mode, it's very laggy. Well, not overly to the death laggy, but it's not smooth running, I guess. If I can manage to go up. Oh, that's down. This is kind of what my museum looks like from the top. I have all the different blueprints and trigger box stuff. Wanted to show kind of the full view of the factory because I thought that this was a really cool part. So, yeah, this is my museum, still on a mountain, and yeah, I really hope you like it, and I hope I get an A, because it took me too long to do this. Thank you so much for watching, and yeah.
Hello, I'm Ava Richards. Welcome to my U.S. History Museum. This museum has three main focuses: women's history, African American history, and the history of industrialization and progressivism. Let's begin with African American history. This exhibit's focus is between 1917 and the late 1960s. Beginning in 1917, there was a period called the Great Migration, in which hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the southern United States to the north. People moved into cities like Harlem, New York. Prior to the Great Migration, Harlem was a wealthy white neighborhood. However, it later became a cultural hub for African American musicians, artists, and writers. To the left, you can see a modeled gramophone to represent the music of the era. Here you can see a painting called The Creation by Aaron Douglas. If I press F, you can see an attribution for the image. However, this period was not without violence. Starting with the Red Summer of 1919 in Charleston, South Carolina, a string of race riots began across the nation. Both black and white people were killed, but African American people were blamed in the media. Beginning in the middle of the 20th century, the civil rights movement rose in popularity. The NAACP began in 1909 to combat racism. However, it mainly catered to upper-middle-class black Americans. SNCC was started as a way for college students to get involved in civil rights. Many other organizations existed. Some resisted white violence, others did not. Nonviolent protesting was used to paint white racists as irrational and angry as television grew in popularity. Eventually, in 1965, the Voters' Rights Act and the 24th Amendment ended poll taxes, literacy tests, and other methods to prevent people from voting. This did not end racism. Nothing really has, but it was a great victory for the movement. Let's move on to women's history. Beginning in the 1830s, there was a movement called the Cult of True Womanhood, or the Cult of Domesticity, which proposed that society was losing its traditional ideas. This forced women into the private sphere, the home. Individuals complaining about sexism in their daily lives turned into a large movement calling for the end of discrimination based on sex. In 1920, The 19th Amendment gave this right. During this time, it also became more socially acceptable for a woman to work outside of the home because of World War I. After World War II, however, veterans wanted to settle down and have wives and children. Women were forced out of any jobs they took in the absence of men. In the 1970s, Shirley Chisholm became the first black woman to run for president. She was not elected, but her campaign is evident that there has been some societal growth. In 2016, Hillary Clinton ran for president. Though she won the popular vote, she did not win the vote of the Electoral College. That election was the closest a woman has ever gotten to presidency. Sexism is still prevalent in media, street harassment, and more, but it's important to recognize that there has been growth. Here in this video, you can see that over a span of 12 hours, a woman was countlessly harassed for her appearance, even though she's very clearly wearing just a t-shirt and jeans. Moving on to industrialization. If I can get over there. Here you can see a short film my peers and I made. The two videos are made into one playlist, and if I press I, then it should play. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but there you go. Between the year 1877 and 1920 was a period of rapid economic change. Mark Twain called the years between 1877 and 1890 the Gilded Age because though it seemed prosperous, the working class were living in squalor. Children were forced to work, the government was corrupt, and the food and drug industries were completely unregulated. However, the rich prospered. As seen on this illustration, the workers are struggling. They're holding up a barge, and they're probably drowning. The robber barons, or CEOs who exploit workers, are dry and safe on the ship's deck. They do not work at all. This image mirrors the area of industrialization. The title robber baron brings a few names to mind. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt all ran monopolies of their respective industries. However, as the press began to expose the robber barons and the workers began striking, change was slowly made. When journalist Upton Sinclair released a book called The Jungle, the public was outraged. The book, though fictional, made readers squirm as they read about the horrors of the meatpacking industry. It was revealed that due to a lack of worker safety, there was a chance people were consuming the flesh of workers mixed in within their meals. This book helped spark a revolution. After William McKinley, who was the puppet of the robber barons, was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt used his presidency to bust monopolies, regulate the workplace, and begin conservation efforts. However, the movement halted in the 1910s because of World War I. After viewing all three exhibits, it is best that we remember that racism, sexism, and classism are still present today. If we know their histories, perhaps we can help dismantle these oppressive systems in the future.
Hello and welcome to the video tour of my virtual history museum. This will cover women's history, industrialization in the Progressive Era, and African American history. Let's begin. This is the Women's History Museum. The first thing you'll see as you walk in are two propaganda posters from World War II. These are important as they show the first time women were encouraged to join the workforce and do a quote-unquote man's job. Companies needed women to work while men went off to war. Soon, women also made their own branches of the Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Army. Now, on this back wall, you'll see a mannequin that's supposed to represent Sojourner Truth. If you press F here, audio of a reading of her Ain't I a Woman speech from Akron, Ohio in 1851 will play. On the back, we have a display of the public and private sphere. Men are on the left in the public sphere, while women are on the right in the private sphere. From the 1800s to 1920s, this was encouraged. Then in the 20s, women gained the right to vote, and society shifted its expectations. Now we'll move on to the Industrialization and Progressive Era Museum. So, that's this museum. As you walk in, the first thing you'll see are two silent films made in class playing. These basically cover a brief description of what went on in the era. There's that one. There's this one. Now on both walls, posters show different books, propaganda, and political cartoons from the era. So you've got The Jungle, which is a book about the meatpacking industry. You've got 8 Hours a Workday, and you've got other things like that, Prohibition. And then on the back, you have a scene that's supposed to be representing a strike. So, workers often went on strike to protest poor working conditions and treatment, but they usually turned violent and didn't really make a lot of change. Now we'll move on to African American history. So this is the African American History Museum. And the first thing you see as you walk in is a tree. Now, this tree is supposed to represent a key point of, like, Jim Crow history, which was lynchings. So, if black people were seen doing something a white person didn't like, they would often be hanged from trees or lynched as, like, public display and entertainment for white people. On the walls, there are several images and propaganda things from the Civil Rights Movement. So, this is the Double V campaign used in World War II. This is for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This one has members of the NAACP and a SNCC poster as well. And then on the back is information about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Martin Luther King Jr. was a reverend leader in the Civil Rights Movement who advocated for nonviolent protesting and organized several well-known events such as the I Have a Dream speech. He was assassinated on April 4th, the day after his I've Been to the Mountaintop address. Coincidence? I think not. Malcolm X was a leader of the Civil Rights Movement, speaking from a Muslim rather than Christian's perspective. He was not against using violence as a means of bringing about change. He was assassinated on February 21st, 1965. That's everything in the museums. Thank you for watching.
Hello, it's Rachel Sane, and this is my U.S. History Virtual Museum for the Women's Unit. I will be walking through my 3 exhibits. Here I have a sign for my museum. Here is my first exhibit, Barbie Career Dolls. I chose to put this in here because seeing what a big company like Mattel does can really reflect on society. The sign states, in 1959, Mattel released the first Barbie career doll, the fashion model. Since then, Barbie has had many other careers, becoming more successful as society's views on women change. I have 8 dolls, ranging from the first in 1959 to a recent one in 2018. They really do show a lot, like how in 1960, a career they chose was a fashion designer, but yet, and in 2004, a career they have is a presidential candidate. And in 2018, they have a robotics engineer Barbie. Next, I will move on to my second exhibit, Protests. I have 2 examples here. The first one is suffrage protests. My plaque reads, "The most important fight for American women was suffrage. Women did not get the right to vote until 1920. And I have a quote from suffrage leader Susan B. Anthony. On the other side of the hall, there is a much more recent protest, the Women's March 2018. This plaque reads, "Across the U.S., hundreds of thousands of people joined this event. Some big cities that joined were New York, D.C., Los Angeles, and Chicago. It was in support of women's and minorities' rights. In the last room down the hall, I have my Women's History Reflective Essay. And as you walk through the room, you can see all 3 pages of my essay. And then you can actually see my sources here. So, that's my Women's History project. Thank you for listening. And I hope you learned a little bit about women's history and you liked my exhibit.